Welcome, everyone. I'm Joan Brzezinski, and I direct the China Center. I thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the University of Minnesota China Center's Considering China webinar with author Peter Hessler. I thank you for your support of the China Center and the Considering China webinar series. I wish to offer a special thanks to Kai Mei and Joseph Terry for their generous support of this program. There will be Q&A directly following the presentation. Please submit your questions that you may have throughout the program through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the program. Peter Hessler is the author of 6 books and has worked as a staff writer for The New Yorker. He first went to live in China as a Peace Corps volunteer from 1996 to 1998, an experience that became the subject of his book, Rivertown. Rivertown described his experience in teaching in Fuling and the lives of his students, and resonated greatly with many of our international colleagues. In his book, Other Rivers, A Chinese Education, he revisits Fuling students and teaches a new generation, revealing how Chinese education and society have evolved and changed over these many years. Please welcome Peter Hessler and his presentation From Reform Generation to Generation C, a teacher returns to the Chinese classroom after 20 years. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Joan. And thanks so much to the University of Minnesota for hosting me. Yeah, my name is Peter Hessler. I'm talking to you today from southwestern Colorado, where I live. And I'm talking, as Joan mentioned, about sort of experience of having taught 2 different cohorts of Chinese students. My experience began in 1996 when I was sent to China in the Peace Corps. And before going to China, I actually had very little contact with the country, with the language, with the history. My generation, it wasn't very common to study Chinese. It wasn't common to take courses in Chinese history. And so I arrived in southwestern China, pretty much with, pretty much as a blank slate. And I was sent to a small town called Fuling, where I taught young people who were training to become teachers of English. And they also almost, I think none of them had met an American before. So both of us had a lot to learn. And one of the things that was, part of that learning process was that I also saw myself. And in that first semester, I would often get comments from students because I was teaching writing and teaching English literature, and students would sometimes write about me, and they'd write about Adam Meyer, who was the other Peace Corps volunteer who'd been sent. And during the first month, this was one of the essays I received from a student named Richard. And the title of his essay was "Why Americans Are So Casual." Richard wrote, "I'm a Chinese. As we all know, the Chinese nation is a rather conservative nation. So many of us have conservative thinking in some degree. I don't know whether it is bad or good. Our foreign language teachers, Peter and Adam, came to teach us this term. It provides a good opportunity of understanding the American way of life. In my opinion, they are more casual than us Chinese people. Why do I think so? I'll give you some facts to explain this. For example, when Mr. Hessler is having class, he can scratch himself casually without paying attention to what others may say. He dresses up casually, usually with his belt dropping and dangling. But, to tell you the truth, it isn't considered a good manner in China, especially in old people's eyes. In my opinion, I think it's very natural. Last week, when Miss Thompson, she was another Peace Corps volunteer, gave us a lecture on the American election, she took off her woolen sweater and tied it to her waist. To us Chinese people, it's almost unimaginable. But thanks goodness, we major in English and know something about America. It didn't surprise us. But if other people saw this, they might can't believe their own eyes. So we had this very intense introduction where I was learning about the students, and I was also learning about myself through their eyes. I had been sent with the Peace Corps, which was a very new program. The Peace Corps started in China in 1993 after years of negotiations. The program had originally been slated to show up in the summer of 1989, but of course that was when the protests in Tiananmen Square and the subsequent massacre happened. And so the program was delayed for a long time. The first group finally came in 1993. I was part of the third group that arrived in 1996. And, Chinese and American relations were still very uncertain at that time, but people were trying to have more contact. And this was all part of Deng Xiaoping's Gaiga Kaifang, or Reform and Opening, the program that began in 1978 to sort of open China to the outside world, both economically and in terms of, diplomatic and educational exchanges. So the Peace Corps was, all of us were sent to Sichuan. And at that time, Sichuan included what is now Chongqing. And why were we sent to Sichuan? It basically was because that was Deng Xiaoping's home province. So the U.S. government, when they negotiated for this program, they knew that it would be more likely to be received favorably if it could be connected to a place that mattered to Deng. So that's where we were sent. It turned out that was a really ideal place to go because it's a very good introduction to China. So it was a huge province, and mostly rural, mostly agricultural, and you learned a lot about sort of life away from Beijing and away from Shanghai. Um, and I was teaching actually all of the Peace Corps volunteers were sent to teachers' colleges. And I taught at a college called Fuling Teachers College. And Fuling, as you can see from that map, you can see it's on the eastern side of what was then Sichuan, sort of it's downstream from Chongqing on the Yangtze River. And so I started in the fall semester of 1996, and I was teaching writing and English literature. And my students had pretty much almost all of them had come from the countryside. And most of them had been born in the last 2 years of Mao's life. For example, in 1996, most of the students I taught that year had been born around 1994. It was very unusual for Chinese students at that time to enter college. As you can see here, only 1 out of every 12 college-age Chinese was able to enter any kind of tertiary educational institution at that time. And so Martin Trowell, an influential British sociologist, when he classified the development of modern higher education, he described it as having 3 phases: elite, mass, and universal. And elite means that's when only sort of the educational elite can enter college. And that was the phase that China was in at that time. And so my students almost all had come from the countryside. The year that they had been born, China's population was 83% rural. So this was a very common background. The students, of course, had excelled. Many of them were the first from their villages to go to university, almost always the first from their families. It was very common for them to have parents who couldn't read, who had never been to school at all, who were just subsistence farmers, often with farms of a sixth of an acre or less. They had given themselves English names. You can see these are some of them have written their addresses and their names on the in a book here, and then Kathy, Jimmy. There's a student, and the student on the left his name was Mo. We had a number of students who, as they progressed and as their English got better, they decided that they needed longer English names because my Chinese name was Huawei, and Adam Meyer, the other volunteer, his name was Meiji, and we had sort of proper Chinese names with family names, and some of our students decided that they should do that as well. And so I had a student named Willie who became William Foster, and then eventually became William Jefferson Foster. And you start to get these, I had another student who went from George to George Baker Frost. They always seem to choose these sort of waspy names. And Mo, who was the class monitor, his name was changed to Mo Money his last year. And you can see him in the picture there. He actually wasn't a smoker, but Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders often had pictures of them holding cigarettes, so it's common for students to do the same thing. And they were often as I said, the first from their generation to enter college. And they didn't have much money. Many of them had known fairly serious poverty when they were young. And you could tell as a teacher. I mean, it's interesting when I look at these pictures of these students. I often still associate certain students with certain outfits. Like you can see the boy in the back. His name was Daisy, who's in the camouflage jacket. He wore that every day. Or the student in the front right, first row, named Lucy, who was wearing that sort of turquoise sweater. You learned initially to recognize them through their clothes because people didn't change their clothes very often in those days. They had very few outfits, and everything they wore had to be washed by hand. When you got into the winter, all of our classrooms were unheated. And the students, if they had to wash their clothes, they did it by hand in cold water. They didn't have warm water in their dormitories. And they would get these chilblains, which I'd never actually seen before, these sores on their hands, and sometimes they'd get them on their ears. And it's if you're in cold conditions, which is interesting because Sichuan is actually not that cold. It wouldn't get below freezing, but nothing was heated, so it often felt cold. And there can also be a nutritional component to this, and so many of the students didn't eat that well. And another thing that always strikes me when I look at this picture is how tall I look. I mean, I'm actually only 5'9". but I sort of towered over most of the students because many of them had come from fairly poor backgrounds. Um, when students entered the university at that time, their hukou or their registration automatically changed from rural to urban. And that was really the trajectory that they were on. They were on their way to becoming urban people. And there were moments when you could kind of see the signs of this transformation. There's a picture there of Adam and me at a Christmas party, and the students kind of wore their best clothes. The boy between Adam and me, his English name was North. Um, and North was a class monitor, the Banjang. So he was a Communist Party member, and he helped organize the class and sort of, serve as an intermediary with the administration, a very responsible student. He had chosen the English name North, he told me, because for two reasons. One is that North is the traditional direction of authority in China, like Beijing, northern capital. But also because he had read that there was a prime minister in British history named North, which was true. And he had read that in history book somewhere. Frederick North, the Earl of Guilford. I think what North had not read in that book, I think what that book didn't include was that that prime minister was actually the one who had lost the American colonies. So not Britain's finest moment. One of his roommates was the boy on the far right there named Yangtze, and he had chosen his English name from a translation of his Chinese Ming or sort of writing name, the name that he wrote poetry under. Both of those boys were the first from their villages to enter college, and both had come from very modest backgrounds. And so, at times you could get this sense that they were undergoing this transformation, but they still were they weren't very far removed from the fields. And in many cases, I didn't learn about their struggles until later. In 2017, I got a letter from a former student named David who wrote and apologized for not having been a very good student back in the 1990s. I remember David, he certainly was not a bad student, but I did remember that he was always a little bit listless and sometimes fell asleep in class. And in his letter, he wrote, "For 3 years, I did not eat and sleep well. I remember in 1996, for half a year, I just had one meal a day. I was a sad man, but now I'm happy about my life." So often there were things about their backgrounds and challenges and struggles that we didn't understand until later. And there were students like David who really didn't eat very well. Um, and In addition to not knowing everything about their backgrounds, it was a moment when you didn't hear a lot about the past. Their parents' generation had gone through a lot. The parents of these young people were the generation that went through the Great Leap Forward at the end of the 1950s and early 1960s. They also went through the Cultural Revolution, 1966, 1976, the tumultuous period under Mao Zedong. But it didn't come up often in class, and students often commented on how rarely their parents would refer to it. One of the few students who did write something about it was a girl whose name was Emily. She had named herself after Emily Bronte. She was one of the very few students who had come from from a city. She had grown up in Fuling itself and actually on the campus where her father was a professor. Her father was a math professor, and he was one of the most decorated academics at that college. Um, Emily's the one immediately to the right of me there in that picture. She wrote in an essay that year, "When my parents were of my age, the whole country was in a great confusion. Politics went first. Intellectuals were said to have the tendency to follow capitalism, so they were assigned to basic units to accept reformation. My father was one of them. In the following 8 years after he graduated from Sichuan University, he worked in a small coal mine." Her father was actually treated pretty well, it turned out. He was somewhat fortunate. He was sent to a place where the people kind of appreciated the work he was able to do in the mine, in that he was able to help them balance their books and sort of straighten up their accounting. And they sort of became very respectful of him. And so his cultural revolution was not as difficult as it was for many people. But his sister's family didn't have the same luck. They were sent to another remote place. They were also educated, and in this place, the, they were often targeted at political rallies. And Emily's uncle was beaten repeatedly at these rallies and ended up dying young. He had a number of children. They ended up sort of stuck in this small village. They weren't able to go past middle school, partly because the education system wasn't good there, but also because they had this class background. They had been sort of tainted by being connected to the intellectual father. And so Emily's cousin Leo, after he had finished middle school, Emily's father invited him onto the campus, our campus, where he worked as a gardener. So you saw this sort of striking difference between these young people. Emily and her siblings were able to test into university, whereas their cousin, who was also very intelligent, was working with his hands on the campus. She wrote once, "I don't know much about the history of my cousin's family because he and his brothers never talk about it. My father sometimes says something, but he is far from a good storyteller. So what I know are only some fragments. And when my father tries to start a conversation, my cousins say, 'It's the history,' and stop at that. Never have I heard them complain about the past." So that sense of the fairly recent events was quite blank. And it was also at that time a place like Fuling felt quite isolated. The population was 185,000, which sounds big often to Americans, but was very small by Chinese standards. And there was nothing nearby that was urban. So we were surrounded by countryside. If you see that picture there on the left with the farmer and his water buffalo, those were rice terraces that were immediately outside the gate of the college. So when I would take a walk out the gate, that's what I would see. That picture to the right shows Fuling is at the juncture of two rivers. That lower river is the Yangtze. It's coming from the right, from the west. And that other river that you see going off in the north is, I mean, up to the top of the picture is the Wu River, which actually comes in from the south, from Guizhou province. A couple of things you can notice about that picture, and actually both pictures, you can see this haze in both images. It was heavily polluted, even though this area was not very developed. They had coal plants that were very inefficient, and the air was really terribly polluted. You also notice, of course, the intense terracing of the fields. Every bit of possible land was used for farming at that time, and you can tell when you look at that picture of the rivers that there's an enormous amount of traffic. Um, um, of boats, including a lot of docks that are near the main city of Fuling in the right upper hand corner of that picture. It felt quite isolated because at that time there was no highway, there were no railroads. If you wanted to go anywhere, you took a boat, and if you wanted to go to the nearest big city, which was Chongqing, you took a ferry that took 8 hours. So that was all part of our environment. This is a picture of the Yangtze looking down from the northern bank. Um, and across the river is the main city of Fuling. And when you look at that picture, a couple things you notice. One is that the there is a fair amount of new construction. You can see those sort of white colored buildings. Those had all been recently built. So Chinese economic changes, which had already become, they had already started to accelerate in places like Shenzhen and Shanghai. They were starting to have an impact in these smaller kind of fourth tier cities like Fuling. But you notice that down near the river, there's none of those white buildings. There's like a band of of brown there, sort of kind of old structures. And as you travel down the river, you could notice in other towns that that band sort of moved up. And the reason is because Fuling was in the future reservoir area of the Three Gorges Dam. So the dam was being built downstream from us, and it was going to raise the level of the river 150 feet in our town. In some of the towns down from us, it would raise it even more, and in some cases, flood the entire river. So these were changes that were scheduled to happen in 2003. And when you walked around the streets in Fuling, you periodically ran into these signs. That sign shows 177 meter. That's the elevation. And that the top sign says it's part of the Three Gorges project. And that marked where the future reservoir would come. And in 1996 to 1998, it was, quite striking when you'd walk through town and you would see these signs and there's just daily life bustling past, and you would really try to envision what is this place going to be like when this dam is completed. Another thing that was very striking about it is that it rarely came up in conversation. People didn't talk about it much. Even when you chatted with people who lived around these signs, they would just kind of shrug it off. I came to realize it was a little bit like the past. I mean, people didn't focus on either the recent past or the coming future. in part because changes were happening right now and people had to be focused on what was going on now. And they didn't have that much attention to spend on things like where they had come from or where this place was going. Um, of course, like any Chinese city, you did have a sense of the history. If you look at this picture again, if you look in the river, you can see there's a sort of a strip of stone that's in the middle that it runs parallel to the river in the middle of the river, and that was a strip of sandstone called the White Crane Ridge. You can see a little more clearly in this picture. It's right above that boat. In Chinese, it was called the Bai Heliang. And this was a strip that appeared only in the winter because in the winter traditionally the Yangtze drops. The surface of the river would drop. In the summer, of course, it goes up as the snow melts in the Himalayas. And when the river dropped and exposed this rock, this strip of rock, in ancient times, boatsmen had started to use it as a hydrological gauge. So if you were going downstream on the Yangtze, you could stop there and kind of see where the water was, and then you'd have some notion of what to expect downstream in the rapids of the Three Gorges. And at some point, somebody carved two fish, not the one I'm standing by, but two small fish into a rock, and then they began to use that as a gauge. And then they started to inscribe and to note when it appeared. The first inscription that was dated is from 763 in the Tang Dynasty, and eventually it became a tradition to do this, and sort of an artistic tradition. So people would inscribe calligraphy, and you had kind of characters all throughout this, and it ended up more than 300,000 characters were carved into this ridge. It's a really spectacular archaeological site. Very few people visited. Of course, Fuling was not a town that had much tourism. If you went down there in the winter, there was a fishing family that you can see this boat here in the foreground. So they lived in that boat, and then they had a small sampan, and you would pay them the equivalent of about 25 cents, and they would take you out to the ridge there. And if you look on that ridge, you can see there's a figure there who's standing there and kind of waving, and his name was Huang Dejian, and he was sort of from the local archaeological bureau. They had posted him there, so all winter he would sit out there, kind of at this on this wooden stool, and he usually wore this very heavy um, People's Liberation Army coat because it's quite cold there on the river. And he knew everything about these characters. You could ask him because I bought a book locally that talked about these inscriptions, and if there was one from a famous calligrapher, I'd ask him where if he could find it, and he would point it out to me. Of course, every time I went out there, I was also thinking, I wonder what's going to happen to this place. When I asked him about it, he's like, "Oh, they're going to build an underwater museum to preserve it," which to me sounded like kind of a crazy idea. By my last year in Fuling as a Peace Corps volunteer, I was often studying Chinese by reading the newspaper, and on January 1st of that year, there was an article that I clipped from the Chongqing Wanbao, the evening news. And the headline was "The White Crane Ridge Inscriptions Protection Plan to be Determined." And this article sort of outlined two possibilities that they were considering. One of them was to build an underwater museum, just like Huang Dejian said. The other proposal was just to make rubbings of all of the inscriptions and keep them in some kind of exhibition hall. Um, and it seemed to me, I remember when I studied this in class, I talked to my Chinese tutor about it, and he said, "This is crazy. They always talk about these things and they never do them. There's no way they're going to build this." And to me at the time, of course, that was true because this was a town that didn't even have a traffic light, no highway, no railroad. And in my first book, Rivertown, when I wrote about this, I said, I talked about that proposal to take rubbings, and I wrote, "To them, this would undoubtedly be the more practical solution. The region simply didn't have the sort of resources necessary to build an underwater exhibition chamber. Experts estimated that within 10 years of the dam's completion, the silt and sand of the new reservoir would erase all 12 centuries worth of carvings." Um, so, even if people didn't talk much about the past and the future, as an outsider, I was very conscious of this and also very curious about where things were going. I did have a sense that these people I taught were, of a remarkable generation, because of these transitions they were making from being uneducated to being well educated, from the countryside to the city. And you could tell that they might even become middle class people. And so one thing that I did before I left was I gathered all of their addresses. In those days, people didn't have cell phones and none of my students had an email address. So I got their mailing addresses in their villages. And then after I left, I began a routine of every semester I would send out a letter to all of my students. It helped that in 1999, I moved back to Beijing to become a journalist. And so it was easier to send letters inside of China rather than doing it internationally. And so I would receive all of these letters from my former students, and I still have file cabinets full of these. And they would come in these kind of paper envelopes, hand addressed. Um, and we started this correspondence where they would tell me about their jobs. Almost all of them became teachers. I think it was about 90% of them ended up becoming teachers, which is what they'd been trained for. And they would write me about their lives. Initially, like a lot of rural people, they married very young. And so during the first couple of years after I left, I often had letters from them about their courtships and their marriages. In December 20th of 2000, I got a letter from a woman student, and she wrote, "Last winter, I was married with a doctor. He is not very handsome, but he is very kind to me. Next spring, we will have a baby." On November 15th of 2004, a student wrote, "What makes me happy is that I married an ugly woman who graduated from the math department of Fuling Teachers College." And then on April 22nd in 2000, another boy wrote a long letter. "After graduating Fuling Teachers College, my parents and relatives wanted to introduce girlfriends to me. Some were very beautiful, but when they saw me, they at once went away and left a word. The toad wants to eat the meat of the swan. Now, I find a girlfriend finally. She will be my wife after 2000. She isn't beautiful. There are many black points on her face, but I love her because she has more money than me. Maybe I love her more. Maybe I love her money more. I have many things to say, but I can't write out. This letter is typed from my girlfriend's computer." As an American, it was always funny to read these letters because I came to think of them as sort of, even though these students were becoming urban people and becoming middle class people, they still had many of the traditional sort of thinking patterns of people in the countryside. And one important thing is modesty, that you try not to take too much pleasure in anything that's going well. And so they would, if they were married, they would always say, "Oh no, my husband's not. He's not handsome. My wife is not pretty." It was almost reflexive and almost a way of warding off bad luck. Um, and so we carried on this correspondence for ever since 1996. So now it's been about 30 years. And after maybe 10 years or so, I started to send them surveys because by that point, we had been in touch for so long. I often went back and visited people. They had read my books and articles, both in English and in translation. And so we had a high level of trust. And I realized I could send them surveys and learn more about their lives and about their ideas about certain things. Um, and one of the things I sometimes asked about was their income, and how their financial lives had changed. When they first began teaching in the late 1990s, most of them were the ones who became teachers usually made about $500 a year, the equivalent of 500 American dollars. In my 2014 survey, their median household income had risen to become nearly 18,000. And then 7 years after that, it had essentially doubled. And so, one thing I could track is that very quickly their material conditions improved. And when I went back, this picture there is during one of my visits. You can see Mo Money there on the far left. And they look like urban middle class people, which is what they are. Almost all of them, when I did surveys, have apartments and cars. Actually, usually they have two or three apartments. And so you would see this sort of rapid improvement. This was a group of people when I sort of put them in historical context, they had very few advantages. They weren't born with good connections. They were born in remote areas. Their parents weren't educated, but they had incredible timing because they were born around the time that Mao Zedong died. They basically grew up with Deng Xiaoping's changes, with that reform and opening. And that's why in my book, I came to call them the reform generation, because so many changes happened into that cohort of people during their adult lives. For example, more than a quarter of a billion rural Chinese moved to the cities. And in 2011, China as a population officially became majority urban. And since the beginning of the reform era in 1978, an even greater number of citizens, nearly 800 million, have escaped poverty. So, you sort of see these numbers as an American, and they're so overwhelming, it's almost meaningless, right? But if you watch this at the individual level, it's quite striking. For example, I mentioned earlier those students north in Yangtze. They were uh, some of the few ones who did not go into teaching. Some of the ones who didn't take teaching jobs, often it was because in some cases their families were so poor that they felt like I have to try to find a different way to make a living. Now, Yangtze started as a teacher, but while he was teaching, he set up a small training class for students to use to learn how to type because he had heard that computers were becoming more important, and he started this after school class. It became very popular, and kids would pay tuition. Just like it was only like a quarter a day for a kid to take his class, but it added up, and he was able to use that money to open a little cell phone shop in Fuling. And when he opened his cell phone shop, he also stocked some walkie-talkies. And just because one of the distributors had given them to him, and he didn't think that this was something that anybody would really want, but he realized very quickly that they were actually selling a lot better than the phones. And then what he realized was that the construction crews were buying them. And so if you were on a Chinese construction crew, most of the workers in those times couldn't quite afford cell phones, and cell phones you had to pay for every call in those days. So walkie-talkies were better. And if your construction crew expanded, you had to buy more walkie-talkies. You go back to the same shop. And Yangtze was the first one in Fuling to realize this market. And of course, there's construction happening everywhere in this region because of the Three Gorges Dam. And so he kind of cornered the market on this, and he became fabulously wealthy. And then he went into real estate speculation. He went into buying, developing parking lot systems for new apartments, all of these sort of infrastructure of urban development. And when I visited him in 2021, um, he was driving this car there that you can see on the left, which is a Mercedes S350, which costs more than $150,000. So this is somebody who'd grown up in incredibly modest circumstances and had become very successful. North had also done well. North's, many of these students, because they had no special training or relationships, they found these very clever niches like the walkie-talkies. The niche that North found was that many apartments had been built to house the Three Gorges refugees, and they were built very quickly and sort of as cheaply as possible, and they didn't have elevators usually. And so 20 years later, he would go through and add elevators onto the exteriors. And you can see that from these images that's an example of North's project. You can see that glass elevator is put on the outside of a building that was built to house people from that Three Gorges region. So I returned to live in China in 2019, which was basically 20 years after I had left the Peace Corps. And that was my idea. 20 years is about a generation, and I would spend time with people like North and Yangtze and learn about their lives. But I also was interested in teaching today's young people. So I wasn't able to teach in Fuling, but I taught at Sichuan University, which is not too far away in the city of Chengdu. And so I started there in 2019. As I mentioned earlier, in 1996, when I taught, only 8% of college-age Chinese had been able to go to college or any other kind of tertiary educational institution. By 2019, that figure had risen to 51.6%. And anything more than 50% is what you would call universal education. So it's sort of amazing. In one generation, China had passed through all three of those stages. I don't think there's ever been another society that's done that. And to do that, they had to expand all these places. So the college where I taught in Fuling in 1998, when I left, had 2,000 students. 6 years later, they had expanded to 20,000. And that happened really in all of the colleges that the Peace Corps volunteers taught around Sichuan and Chongqing. Pretty much all of them expanded tenfold. So really just sort of staggering change. In Fuling, they built a new campus because it wouldn't fit on the old site. And that was true at almost every college where Peace Corps volunteers fought. They built new campuses. At Sichuan University, where I taught, I was also at a new campus. Another thing that really struck me, you can see a picture of me there with with the students in 20, that was 2021. A lot of them are taller than me. And when I would show them that picture of me sort of towering over the Fuling students, the Chongqing University, the Sichuan University students would laugh. And I would always ask them, I wonder how I got so much shorter. And in 2020, a study in the Lancet, the British medical journal reported that out of 200 countries, China had seen the largest increase in boys' height and the third largest in girls' height since 1985. And the average Chinese 19-year-old male was now more than 3.5 inches taller. So again, of these changes that we sort of, there can be very abstract, but when you're there in the classroom and just the sheer physicality, like how different, these students look, it really brings home those material changes. These are pictures there on the left of former Fuling students with their sons, and you can see their sons are, usually a head taller. And when I go back and visit my students with their children, that was almost always the case. They also had a very different relationship to the past. It was interesting. I remembered, so of course, in the 90s, when the students, their parents had never talked to them about the past. And this was not true of this newer cohort. They often wrote in their essays a lot about their parents' stories. Their parents liked to talk about the past. And this was a student named Fenton. You can see in the picture there, he's one of the students who was a lot taller than me. He was from Shandong in the east. And he wrote in one of his essays, before I left home and went to college, I had such an interest in listening to my parents' stories about their childhood. When my dad was my age, he worked as a taxi driver, and my mother was a woman worker in the state-owned flour factory. I was born in the crossroad of two centuries. Taking advantage of the rapid development of market economy in the coming century, they decided to devote themselves to industry. These are the stories from when they grew up, and what I like is that they are the stories of their childhood in the countryside. These stories have a fairly fixed and smooth pattern, which can be said to be similar to the current superhero genre films. Our childhood living conditions were not good, is always the beginning of this kind of story. In the middle is something that seems to be easy to realize now, but was difficult at that time. And you must cherish everything you have now is always at the end of these stories. So a very different relationship to the past. That earlier generation, the events that they went through, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, those were political events. They came from Beijing, they came from other parts of the country. People had felt they had no control over it. The stories that people like Fenton were talking about were economic changes, and they were personal. These were things that people felt like their decisions mattered. His father became a taxi driver. Then he started a little factory that made plastic bags. He expanded that factory and eventually became a successful businessman. And so from his perspective, he had agency. He had made decisions that resulted in changes to his life. And he liked talking about this. It was a totally different relationship to the past. So when I went back to Sichuan University, I would often return to Fuling to visit people and also just to kind of see how things had changed. And sometimes I was able to recreate images um, through through pictures, going through my old photos. The trip became a lot easier because they built three highways and two rail lines. And so that 8-hour trip from Chongqing was 38 minutes on a fast train. You can see in those images of the rivers, um, the main thing you notice is how much cleaner the air is. If you look at that image to the right, I can see mountains that I never saw in the past. There's a new bridge there across the Wu River, and you can see all of the new development there. Another thing that's quite striking from that image is the boats. Most of the boats are gone, and the docks near Fuling, the river became much less used for transport. It's very rare nowadays to take a boat on the Yangtze. And you also notice those fields on the left are pretty much gone. They're overgrown with trees. People don't farm as intensely anymore. All of those people left the countryside. Um, it's another image that I have here. This is, looking down on the river there. And again, that band of buildings down near the water was demolished. The river has widened. And in Fuling, it wasn't totally inundated, but just the lower level wasn't. So they expanded the city and they put a dike there against the wall. And then all the development was up above there. And another thing you notice in this picture is if you look on the lower left, you can see that temple there in the right image. In the left, you can see that it was rubble. And that was a temple that had been actually taken down during the Great Leap Forward because of poverty, actually. People told me in the area that they had dismantled it to try to sell the pieces for scrap because they were so hungry. It had been rebuilt by that second image. And actually, I didn't realize that until I took these images and compared them. So you would sometimes notice things that had changed in the landscape. Of course, you can also see from there the White Crane Ridge, which is visible in the image to the left, is gone, is now underneath the river there. Um, and that dike that's below the city is now a walkway. And when you walk along that it's kind of like the Bund in Shanghai. They have these exhibits which are like these old industrial tools, which are things actually from the 90s and early 2000s. This is one of the inscriptions. In 2005, the government of Fuling decided to close the Kanghewan Pier. The site retained some relics and equipment to commemorate those who contributed to the economic construction and urban development of Fuling. So it's almost as if time had moved so quickly that these things that were being used when I was there 20 years ago are now artifacts. They're completely outdated and they have them, almost like museum pieces along that that bund. And if you walk along there, you come to this museum that's set into the bund. You go into the museum, and there's this long escalator, and you go down the escalator. That's my wife, Leslie, and my twin daughters, or twin daughters. And you go down, and then you're in this long walkway, and they have these like portals, like submarine portals. And you look through those, and you're looking out at the White Crane Ridge. Those are the images, those are the rocks that have the inscriptions. Um, so that you go down this 300-foot escalator, um, and uh, and you see. So that museum, which had seemed like an absurd project when I was in Fuling, turned out to have been built. It cost $35 million. They were able to do it, and now tourists can go there. And it's a very eerie experience to go because I remembered. So when I look at those characters, I can remember standing on them and touching them and feeling them. I mean and that also that sense of continuity. In 1998, when I took this picture, on the left, the water level was 2 inches higher than it had been in 763 AD, and you had this sense of these cycles that had been there forever. And now that's completely different. The water no longer goes up and down. It's it's fed at a fixed level from the reservoir. And when you go to the museum, you're looking out at these things that are now deep underwater. But interestingly, when I go to the museum, the director was Huang Dejian. So the guy on the left there in the picture is the same guy who used to sit out on the rock. And those days he'd wear the PLA, coat and kind of shiver on the rocks. And he eventually became the director of this new $35 million museum. And you'd often see him there with various dignitaries and officials, and he's usually wearing a suit. And it's sort of a striking thing that despite all of these changes, you see the people somehow are very recognizable. And sometimes there's a sense that nothing's changed. It's the same guy who's there in charge of the museum. And so you're always trying to balance these as an outsider. How much have things changed? Emily there to the right, I talked about her cousin Leo, who had poor fortune because of his family's political problems. And he was a gardener on campus. He ended up leaving campus and going to Kunming, um, where he worked he worked initially as a ditch digger, just to, kind of the lowest type of labor you could do. And then he sort of transitioned to construction crews and eventually started to manage his own construction crew. He was very good at math naturally, even though he wasn't educated. And he turned out to have a sort of a genius for being able to give people estimates on how much a project would cost. And so the builders realized that they could trust him. And so his crew became popular and he did quite well. Then he eventually started his own small construction business. He expanded the construction business. He started to buy real estate. He did that and moved back to Chongqing and did development there, started development projects in northern China. And by 2010, his net worth was estimated to be in the tens of millions of dollars. That year, he donated more than $500,000 US to charity. So this sort of sometimes you would have these incredible stories of people like, Yangtze, or people like Emily's cousin who had transformed their lives. This was a moment when that was really possible. Um, so but while we've had all of those changes, one thing that's quite striking is no political change. The Communist Party is still in charge, and in many ways, under Xi Jinping, the climate is more oppressive than it was even in the early 2000s, or even when I taught there in the 1990s. So that expansion of education is an interesting issue because it hasn't necessarily had caused the larger changes that we might expect. There's an interesting essay about this by a historian at Harvard named Elizabeth J. Perry, that she calls this educated acquiescence, how academia sustains authoritarianism in China. She writes, one might have expected that opening China's ivory tower to an infusion of scholars and dollars from around the world would work to liberalize the intellectual climate on Chinese campuses. Yet Chinese universities remain oases of political compliance amidst the social contention that has swept much of the rest of the country. So this is something that, as educated people in America, it's interesting to think about. And Perry theorizes that the traditions of China of education were always more tightly tied to the state, to authority, than they were in the West. And this is one reason why educated people were being prepared to be part of the state and not to oppose the state in different ways. I do find that, having been back there and taught, that I find it hard to predict if this continues to be the case. Because the young people today are so much better connected than they were in the past. They travel a lot. More than half of the passports in China are for millennials or younger. But I did sense the young people I taught at Sichuan University were profoundly disengaged with politics. I mean, we have this, they were indoctrinated in politics, just like my students were in the 1990s. They had to take certain classes that were to train them on the party. But they tended to ignore them. And I found them not to be sort of as intensely patriotic, actually, as the young people I remembered from the 90s. And it was also interesting to me that after I finished teaching for 2 years at Sichuan University, when I looked back, I couldn't remember actually any student in class ever bringing up Xi Jinping's name. Um, and I went through the papers. I reviewed more than 500 papers, and I could find only 22 times that Xi Jinping's name was mentioned, and usually it was just in passing. This was very different from the 1990s. Like in the fall semester of 1996, I asked my students in Fuling to write about their heroes, and of the 22 who wrote about public figures, 15 chose political leaders. Mao was the most popular, followed by Deng and then Zhou Enlai. For that generation, nobody chose a scientist or an entrepreneur. The people that they would list as their heroes were politicians. When I asked that question again at Sichuan University more than 20 years later, I did this in 5 sections of first year composition. And the most popular choices by far were scientists and entrepreneurs. Out of the 65 students, 9 wrote about political leaders, 4 for Mao Zedong, 3 Deng Xiaoping, 1 Zhou Enlai, and only 1 student chose Xi Jinping, which meant that he was tied with Eminem, Jim Morrison, Lionel Messi, and George Washington. The student who chose George Washington wrote, "The reason why I admire him most is that he gave up his political power voluntarily." Um, so often when they made comments about politics, it was indirectly like that. Uh, in the years since, I've been corresponding with the students I taught at Sichuan University, and I've started sending them surveys as well. And I sent them a survey in 2023 last year. One of the questions I asked was, um, what do you worry about the most? And out of 47 responses, only 3 specified the possibility of war with Taiwan. Only 3 mentioned politics. Only 1 said environmental issues. I think if you asked that of American undergraduates, many of them would say environmental issues. The vast majority of answers among my Chinese students were very personal, and usually it was job opportunities or issues with graduate school. I think this reflects a couple of things. One is that you're taught not to think about, you just sort of learn not to think about the big questions because you can't necessarily affect them. It's part of this disengagement from politics. I think it's also because of the intense competition. And one thing that I noticed is how much more competitive Chinese society is, and that really weighed on the young people I taught. So when I compare these 2 cohorts, it's interesting because in some ways, the students in the 90s had, of course, a much tougher situation, that they were coming out of serious poverty. People like David, who had 1 meal a day. But in some ways, their challenge was very straightforward. They wanted to become educated, they wanted to leave the countryside, and they wanted to escape poverty. And those are not necessarily simple things, but they were all possible, and you could see the pathways very clearly at that time. And pretty much all of those young people did that. I mean, actually, I don't know any of them who didn't succeed in all 3 of those things. But nowadays it's more complicated. I think the question now is, when you've achieved material comfort, what do you care about now? How do you want to live? What are your priorities? And I could see my younger students sort of struggling with this, and trying to figure out what their values were going to be. And I think this generation is going to grapple with this. One question I asked them was, "Do you want to have children eventually?" And those students, the majority answered no. And it was particularly striking among the women students. Of the 25 women who responded, 19 did not want to have children, 76%. One of them wrote, "We are already a confused generation, and children's upbringing requires long periods of companionship and observation and guidance, which is difficult to ensure in the face of intense social pressure. The future of Chinese society is an adventure, and children do not demand to be born. I'm worried that my children are not warriors and are lost in it." So I want to stop there. Let me get the screen. Yeah, so I'd like to stop there and open up for questions. So anybody who has a question about this or anything related to China or writing about China, I'd be happy to answer.
Yes, if you could please put those in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We already have a few questions up here. Start with the first. It's a little long. What a pleasure to meet you, Peter. I am a Peace Corps China volunteer, and it says 18, I guess that's a cohort, taught in Chongqing from 2012 to 2014. Your work was and continues to be tremendously helpful, enlightening to me. Rivertown was really helpful during my first year as a volunteer. The excerpts from your students' letters remind me that how much of my students describe their lives and ideas. I'm curious to know about your women's students. What do you find striking about their stories? Post-college degree, are they similar or different than those of your male students? Did you notice any patterns, uniqueness?
Yeah, there is, I mean, I think the thing that was really most striking actually was that all of them worked, all of them taught. I mean, I didn't teach a single woman in the 1990s who didn't have a full-time career, took her career as seriously as her husband did. None of them stopped teaching to raise children. That has become more common. So when we were in Chengdu, my daughters were in a Chinese school, and it was striking how many women had stopped working to manage the child's education. It was almost always the mother who would do that. Very rarely would the father do that. And so that to me really jumped in. And it sort of reflected this competitive society. There was this fear that we need to have so much support, and it's usually just one child because they almost all had one children. And but still they felt like they needed to have a parent to oversee that. And that task often fell to the women. Whereas the students I taught in 1990s never did that. The other thing I noticed, I read about this in my book, is I feel like the my women students from the 90s are probably healthier. They always kind of look better, like they look like they've aged better, and it's partly because the men had more obligations in terms of getting invited to these banquets where they would exchange cigarettes and smoke. And the boys often wrote me letters about this, like my health isn't good because I have to drink too much. This was part of their generations, the way that you did business in China. Even if you're a teacher, you kind of had to do a lot of that. So those were a couple of the things that really struck out in terms of gender differences.
Thank you. Do you think your survey responses in summer of 2023 were self-centered due to potential authoritarian oversight?
I don't think, I mean, I don't really think so. I mean, I told them I'm using it for my writing. These students have read my writing, so they know what I do. I don't think the fear was that intense, and many of them were actually overseas when we were doing this. Like, huge numbers of those students I taught in Chengdu followed that experience with a year or two abroad. Most of them had not yet entered the workforce. That it's kind of become more common for students to enter the workforce later. So yeah, I think in general that they were giving me pretty accurate response, because a lot of the responses they were giving me were not the things that the party would want them to say, to be honest.
So, another person, thank you for this wonderful talk. I was a teacher in Xi'an from 97 to 99. You even stayed at my place when I was on a trip, thanks to our mutual friend, Michael G. Question, what do you see your next China chapter might entail? And I know that you have returned home, but questions of yours are left unanswered.
Yeah, so I left in 2020. We originally had planned to be there for 5 years. But my wife and my kids, we all left in 2021 after only 2 years. My contract wasn't renewed at Sichuan University. And it was sort of related to my writing and to COVID, and it's become a quite difficult place to live as a writer. I think it's not really possible for a writer like me to be at a university right now in China. And it's hard for American journalists to get visas because of the various conflicts between the US and China. So that's also something that I didn't envision in the 90s. Like, I didn't think that 20 years later the relations would be worse, right? At that time, the Peace Corps was sort of seen as a fragile program because we were afraid that the Chinese could cancel it, because there were people in the Chinese government we knew who didn't want Americans in these small cities. But very sadly, it was canceled in the early 2020, but it was the Americans who did it. It was a Trump administration that pulled out the program. So all of that is quite dispiriting. I think it'll probably be a while before I live in China again. I'm hoping that I can make a trip back this coming year, partly to bring my daughters to study Chinese more. But we'll have to wait and see.
You and Ian Johnson are leading American journalists on contemporary China, and though you are friends, you've taken very different approaches. What are your thoughts on the difference?
Yeah, Ian's a very close friend. In 1999, when I first started in Beijing, I was actually kind of his assistant, or an assistant in the bureau at the Wall Street Journal where he was. I have a lot of respect for his work. Yeah, I mean, I think Ian has an incredible depth of knowledge about, for example, religion in China. And he's also spent a lot of time looking at issues of history and how people record history. I would say that he's focused more on kind of the intellectual side of the intelligentsia and the communities there and some of the communities around being around dissidents. I think that my own approach has come out of basically my Peace Corps experience, which was that experience prepared me to sort of see what things were like in the interior of China and for people who were more sort of in the middle class. So I think, often you just sort of naturally gravitate to what you have contact with, and those the kind of people I taught were the kind of people I ended up writing about most. But I think it's great to have all different types. Like I think Ian's work is incredibly important. The main thing is that we need more people doing this. That's the problem, is there's so few now. And Ian is also not in China. I don't know if he could get back in to live either, probably not. So I find that dispiriting, and also the fact that there's so few young Americans going over there now, and it's harder for them to go over than it was for us.
What extent do you think various generations in China might be attuned to ideas regarding change that originate outside of China, or interested in dialogue as such ideas? Are there opportunities for partnership and positive changes or reforms? And if so, do you see any of these following a particular pattern?
Yeah, I mean, I think the younger people are so much more aware of things overseas, right? I mean, their English level is so much higher than it was. And in the 90s, very few of my students could actually carry on a conversation. They often wrote very well, as you can tell from the excerpts. Like they wrote beautifully because most of their English education had been, literary, because they didn't have the opportunity to speak with people. But a lot of these young people I taught at Sichuan University, they had gone over for a summer to study in England or in America, and their English was often excellent. And they've had a lot of contact, and of course they know how to get around the firewall, and so that's something that young people tend to learn it if they go to university in China. So I find them very well connected and very well informed. As far as where that goes, again, it is hard, and it is important to remember the kind of thing that Perry mentioned, which is that educational traditions in China are traditionally more tightly tied to the state and to authority. And so the relationship between students and authority is different than it often is in the West, where you have, a strong tradition of protest. And it sort of comes out of the fact that higher education in the West came more out of religious institutions, which were often aligned with the government, but not always. So there is more of a traditional separation in the Western view of education.
I know you covered a lot of this in your book, and I thought it was a really excellent perspective because of the way the West looked at China during the COVID period and during the pandemic. But this person's asking, what was it like to live in China during COVID pandemic in 2020?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very bizarre experience because it, and we had just come out of our first semester, which was really intense because I was teaching for the first time in 20 years. We were setting up a new home, and our kids were in Chinese school for the first, they didn't speak Chinese. And so that first semester, they were learning Chinese at an intense pace, and they required a lot of support from Leslie and me. So we were just sort of, when the news started to come out about some virus in Wuhan, like initially we were just kind of ignoring it, didn't take it very seriously. And then suddenly this lockdown started at the end of January in 2020. And most of the people we knew with kids had left. And we made the decision to stay. I was going to keep teaching. And also everything had been locked down. And, these weren't the lockdowns that they later had where people like stuck in their apartments. You could actually still go out and walk around the city, but almost nobody was. People were afraid. And so our calculation was, well, I don't really see how we can get sick in this environment because nobody's out. So we'll just stay. It turned out that we were fortunate because that initial phase, like that year, 2020, initially, of course, there were all kinds of mistakes and cover-ups and terrible things happened in Wuhan and people died there. But by the end of January, they started to institute better policies, and it turned out that it was better that year. So my kids were back in school that spring, no social distancing, no masks. I was traveling a lot. I mean, I even went to Wuhan in August of 2020, and I went to you know, the the Huanan, seafood emporium, where the whole thing initially spread. And I talked to all kinds of people in Wuhan. And it was really fascinating, but it was amazing. Like I was able to do that all face-to-face interviews. The disease wasn't spreading in China in the summer of 2020. So there was this period when it was probably better to be there in terms of your movement and your daily life. Of course, later that changed once you had Omicron and the vaccines, and China failed to adjust. And that's when we had those terrible lockdowns that we read about 2022, I guess it was, like in Shanghai and many other major cities, and Chengdu suffered from some of that. By that time, we were out of China. We left in the summer of 2021. So in retrospect, we were kind of fortunate. We sort of were in China in the period when it was better to be in China, and then we were in the US in the period when it was better to be here.
Thank you. Do you feel there's an increasing distrust of educators and educational models from outside of China? What impact will that have on bilateral relations and education and cultural exchange?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely, universities and especially, I was at Sichuan University, which is it's not that, it's pretty far from Beijing, and Chengdu has a tradition for being less rigidly controlled, and I could see evidence of that. So I think that university was a little looser and more things were going on. But in general, Chinese, universities right now are pretty tight places. It's harder for, there's fewer foreigners teaching there. There's definitely fewer exchanges with Americans. It concerns me. I mean, I think I'm glad that there's still so many Chinese going abroad. Like, I think there's still, more than 250,000 a year from China to the US alone. And I find that encouraging, but there's not much going in the other direction. And so the students in China are not getting the same kind of contact they did before. I mean, my hope is that this is a phase that we eventually transition out of, but right now we can't see that path.
Well, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Um, what are the differences between the two generations of Chinese students on their perception of the US, especially on the attitude of US to China?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I found that, in the 90s that they had much less information, and I actually thought they were more anti-American, to be honest. I felt like the students, and there were many things that you would say in class that would offend people. And you could tell immediately. I described this in my book that when you would say something, you'd stumble onto some political thing as an American teacher, unknowingly, like if you referred to the Opium War or something like this, the students would kind of get very quiet and they just kind of dropped their heads, and it was this terrible silence, and you would know as a teacher that you had messed up. That never happened actually at Sichuan University, and it's not because I didn't offend people. Like, I found out later there were things that I said, and when my wife came and said that we crossed certain lines, and the students would kind of discuss it amongst themselves, but they didn't. We often couldn't sense it, because they're very good I think, at handling this stuff. They're much more sophisticated. So they knew that, like, there's no reason to disrupt this class because he said something about Taiwan that we wouldn't say. Let's just let it go. Sometimes they would even have these discussions, I found out, kind of surreptitiously while I'm teaching. And so that level of sophistication was quite different. I found them less rigidly anti-American. Like, we talked about the election 2020, I was teaching, and those were very comfortable discussions. We discussed they had all kinds of questions. And it wasn't the way I remembered such discussions being in the past, when they would have felt more politically charged and I would have been really nervous. Like, by 2020, when that happened, I felt pretty relaxed because I knew that these kids could kind of handle whatever I was telling them about something like that.
Yeah, I think we're going to wrap up questions with this last one. And
Okay.
it's, what do you think the average American like us can do to improve the US-China relations?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that people go over. I mean, that's something that, it's a shame the Peace Corps was stopped. Actually, a huge number of our Peace Corps cohort was from Minnesota. I'd have to say Adam Meyer he'd grown up in the Twin Cities. I think we had 4 people out of our small cohort from Minnesota. And I really hope that young people do this. And I think, actually, even though it's hard now, there's probably a lot of opportunity because there's fewer people doing it. So I think a young person can distinguish him or herself by by learning Chinese and by going to this place that fewer people are going to now. I think it's actually a good time, because of these challenges. I think the average person, I mean, I do think we've sort of settled into this view of China as an enemy that I feel like is exaggerated. I think when you live there and when you know people over a long time, that's not the feeling you have. It's often described as the new Cold War, but it's something different, right? During the Cold War, the Soviet Union wasn't sending 300,000 young people to the United States, every year, and we weren't having the kind of trade that we have with China. So this is something different. I don't know if we have a term for it really, but I would also counsel people from using models necessarily from other histories like that. Like, it's not the same as the Soviet Union. It's not going to follow the same path, in my opinion. And even the tensions over Taiwan, I think sometimes we tend to apply rigidly military mindset to that issue, when maybe we should be thinking more in terms of where it might go from diplomacy and economics. That's been the way the Chinese tend to confront big challenges. And so I think sometimes we're under investing in those things and we're not thinking about them enough because we're wrapped up in military possibilities.
Thanks, Peter. This was a really excellent talk and discussion, and I thank everyone for joining us for the webinar today. Please consider helping us provide engaging program like this with a gift to the China Center. You can do so through the link on the webinar announcement or on our website. Join us for our next webinar with Professor Mark Seidel from the University of Wisconsin-Madison on October 29th. His talk will be a hybrid, so if any of you want to join us in person, this is your opportunity. Watch for a forthcoming announcement. Again, thanks everybody for coming today, and thank you, Peter, for a wonderful discussion. Have a great day.
Yeah, no, thanks so much. I appreciate it. Thanks to everybody for tuning in, and thanks for hosting me.